the release of Super Metroid in 1994, the Metroid series was on hiatus. Nintendo's next console was the Nintendo 64, and the plan was originally to develop a Metroid game for that console, with Mario and Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto planning to be the producer. Unfortunately, they struggled to come up with ideas for how this would work. Yoshio Sakamoto, the director for Super Metroid, tried his hand at coming up with a Metroid 64, but has said in the interview he couldn't imagine how the N64 controller could be used to control Samus. And I don't blame him, I still don't understand how we were okay with this controller. This led Nintendo to try their hand at outsourcing the development for a new Metroid title for their next console, the Nintendo GameCube. Enter Retro Studios, a game studio from America. Yes, established in 1998 in Austin, Texas, Retro Studios was founded by Jeff Spangenberg, an experienced programmer and producer at this point in time, and founder of Iguana Entertainment, a company responsible for hits like Turok Dinosaur Hunter and the console versions of NBA Jam. In 1995, Iguana was acquired by Acclaim, and 3 years later, they fired Jeff, which led to him responding with a lawsuit for breach of contract, to which they settled for an undisclosed amount. So at this stage, Jeff is a very wealthy man, and he goes on to establish Retro Studios in his own home. He'd run to Nintendo of America to secure a partnership and funding, and managed to secure that deal to create games for a more mature demographic to appeal to Western audiences once they launched the Nintendo GameCube. The studio grew rapidly, growing to have about 200 employees, fueled by Nintendo's generous investments. But despite this growth, the work environment has been documented as chaotic, and Nintendo started to become more attentive about what was going on behind closed doors. So now at this point, their executives had a large say in their work, unhappy with the early demos they had seen from Retro Studios. But at that time, Retro was working on 4 absolute bangers for the GameCube, like Metaforce, Car Combat, NFL Retro Football, and Raven Blade. I'm just kidding, these were all cancelled. Miyamoto and other members of Nintendo Japan visited Retro Studios to take a look at their work, and his response? Disappointed. So basically what happened on their first visit, it was a bloodbath. A Retro employee recalls, they hated everything that we were doing. We weren't developing games in their philosophy. It was a huge cold splash of water in the face. But Miyamoto did like something, Metaforce, with him feeling impressed with the first-person shooter engine they'd developed for it. He wanted them to take on the next Metroid game using that system. So Miyamoto granted them the license to the Metroid franchise, and it was off to the races. But the development story doesn't end there, because this would be a rocky adventure for Retro Studios. Jeff Spangenberg has been reported to have arrived in the parking lot in his new Ferrari a few months after Nintendo Japan's visit, and he would lay off half his employees during the development of Metroid Prime, with the 4 other games they're originally developing all being cancelled. So the mood at the studio was tense, with some of the developers focused more on their resumes than the game itself. My guy Jeff here is an interesting character. His employees would say that they were lucky to see him once every year in the office, and he is reported to have some interesting extracurricular activities, like running a website called Sinful Summer that had pictures of the pool parties at his house, complete with strippers and scantily clad women. And get this, he was using Retro's servers to host this site. So believe it or not, Nintendo wasn't the biggest fan of Jeff either, and ended up buying his stake to become the majority shareholder and quickly ousted him, replacing him with Steve Barcia, the vice president of development at that time. And this is how Retro Studios became a first-party Nintendo studio. So after all the chaos and destruction, all that was left was a really talented skeleton crew that put in insane amounts of work into Metroid Prime, taking 6 months to develop the very first level that Nintendo approved. And then they had less than a year to finish the game. Nintendo assisted in-house by creating the music and helping with overall design, communicating with Retro through emails and telephone conferences. They initially developed this title as a third-person shooter, but Miyamoto would suggest committing to first-person all the way through to make shooting more intuitive. The director of Metroid Prime, Mark Pacini, supported this decision, but unlike most first-person shooters at that time, he wanted to place heavy focus on exploration with this title, saving the challenging combat for boss encounters so the player could explore in peace. As for Samus herself, throughout the game the player can see glimpses of her reflection throughout the game, during larger explosions that would tease her new model. Originally, Cindy Crawford's face would be used as a reference before they refined it further, and at the end of the game, she's fully revealed. Though there's all these cool unused animations that were intended to be in this game which gave her much more personality, but these would end up being left out of the final product. So despite being a studio at the brink of death and put through the ringer several times over, Retro Studios completed Metroid Prime, and while fans were skeptical of the first-person perspective at first, it would become one of the best-selling games on the GameCube, and was met with critical acclaim, selling 2 million copies worldwide. As for our guy Jeff here, he would go on to create Top Heavy Studios and developed the Guy game, which seems much more up his alley, but the story doesn't even end there. The game would get slapped with a lawsuit because it featured an underage woman. Jeff was never seen in the industry again. Donkey Kong's Crash Course. This attraction is a gem, and a mashup of what seems like the minecart levels from Donkey Kong Country, one of those ball and maze games they used to have at the doctor's office for the kids, and the classic Donkey Kong arcade aesthetic reimagined on a chalkboard. So the goal here is pretty simple: get your tiny rolling cart to the Pauline drawing at the end of the board. But that's easier said than done. This little attraction might actually be more brutal than the original Donkey Kong. Tilting the gyroscope on the Wii U gamepad gives your little triangle cart momentum, but this thing is very fragile. Too fast or too high a drop, and it crumbles, sending you back to the last checkpoint. And the board is split into several areas, each filled with interactive platforms that require precision. You'll press buttons like L or R to raise ramps, spin the gamepad sticks to move pulleys, and even blow into the microphone to spin fans, all while trying to keep your hands steady so you don't accidentally send your cart careening off some ledge. Luckily, if your little triangle gets unstable and you see you're about to crash, you have time to hit the Y button to teleport back to the last checkpoint without losing any lives. It's a small but welcome mercy. So on my return to Nintendo Land, this was the single player attraction I spent the most time in. Pauline must be saved, so it was time to lock the f in, and I'm not leaving Donkey Kong's Crash Course until she's free from his chalky clutches. Yes! I conquered this attraction once and for all. Yeah, so that's when I learned that not only are there 2 courses, but you gotta clear this one twice to unlock the second one, and there are more difficult versions of both of these courses. So at this point, I have to say Nintendo Land might just be the most difficult Nintendo title on Wii U, hands down. So while I was attempting this section over and over again, I remembered an interview with the developers in the Iwata Asks feature for this game. Producer Katsuya Eguchi specifically recommended this attraction, saying, quote, "Depending on the skills and ideas of the player, the course design has been done in a way that you can take shortcuts and do speedruns," end quote. The developers clearly enjoyed designing this one though. It was apparently a favorite during development. Crowds of staff would gather around whoever was test playing to see if they could discover new shortcuts or beat speedrun records. This classic title was the culmination of Miyamoto's idea to bring Mario into the role-playing genre. Remember that company Square that made Final Fantasy? They would jump into this project to work with Nintendo on this title with the mutual desire to popularize RPGs in the West. Thus, they'd start developing Super Mario RPG for the Super Nintendo in 1995. In this adventure, there would be a fresh take on the Mushroom Kingdom, expanding the world to include various new characters and individual towns spread across the land. Even the plot itself wasn't the traditional Mario format. For the first time ever, Mario will have to team up with Bowser to take down an even greater evil named Smithy, who steals Bowser's castle and takes it as a base of his own. With Smithy threatening the Mushroom Kingdom, Mario must travel the world, recruiting new and familiar faces to find the 7 stars and obtain the power to stop Smithy. New, but familiar. This was developed pretty late in the Super Nintendo's life cycle, so the developers wanted to lean into new methods of modeling the characters, going for unique 3D elements by creating CG models, much like the Rare team pulled off with Donkey Kong Country. These CG models were toy-like, intentionally designed to create a unique but charming visual style to pull in a broader audience and set the game apart from the traditional Mario titles. This game broke the mold for conventional RPGs at the time, with Square taking inspiration from their work on Final Fantasy VI. Traditionally, during combat in turn-based RPGs, players will select commands and take turns, similarly to how combat is structured in Dungeons & Dragons. But the Final Fantasy series revolutionized the active time battle system, adding a timer to this turn-based system to pressure players into making quicker decisions and influence faster-paced combat. So Super Mario RPG took a different approach with more action-oriented mechanics like platforming and timing attacks with button inputs to make it feel more Mario-like. After over a year of development, Super Mario RPG was released in Japan in March 1996 and in the US in May 1996. So did this game work as Miyamoto and Square intended, paving the way for RPGs in the West? Well, the short answer is kinda. As expected, the game sold amazingly well in Japan, selling 1.47 million copies, making it the third highest selling game in Japan in 1996. As for the United States, the demand for this game surprised Nintendo. In the first 4 weeks, it sold 200,000 units, which is almost comparable to the lifetime sales of Final Fantasy VI in the US. Initially, Nintendo only shipped 300,000 copies to the US, which led to a shortage of this game in stores. It became the most rented game in America for 14 weeks in a row, and would go on to sell over 1 million copies. Keep in mind, this was the same year that Nintendo 64 and Super Mario 64 arrived, and that same year the competition was heating up with PlayStation, who were off to an amazing start for their first year in the business. With all this considered, and RPGs still being somewhat niche, these were amazing numbers which proved to both Nintendo and Square that the demand was there for more RPGs, and more specifically to Nintendo that Mario RPGs were something they could invest in. As for Square, the following year they would go on to release Final Fantasy VII, which was the big shift in RPGs in the West, with over 1.5 million copies sold in the US alone. This game cemented more investment in that genre, of course. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I'd go as far to say that the sales numbers of Super Mario RPG gave Square a little bit more confidence to push forward and go all in bringing Final Fantasy VII to the West. And this segment really makes me want to start a Final Fantasy series on this channel. Let's hear it in the comment section if there's a demand for it. These are all brand new bosses unique to Oracle of Ages, which makes it pretty clear that the team started development with an original Zelda title in mind, while Oracle of Seasons has a lot of leftovers from its original concept as a Legend of Zelda remake. With this in mind, I've noticed that Oracle of Ages has a tad more polish, and the overall plot is a bit more fleshed out. Not to mention the dungeons feel better designed. Which brings me back to our story of how this lost trilogy panned out. With the mystical seat of power revealed to the world in 1999 and this Triforce series being established, Flagship wanted to be able to link these three titles together and allow them to be picked up and played in any order. With such an ambitious project, the team had over 10 scenario writers working on 3 unique stories, intending to be released 6 weeks apart from each other. So the next in line was Mystical Seed of Wisdom. This was the one that must have become Oracle of Ages, with the puzzles planned to be based around colors? Wait, that doesn't sound right. That's not what we got here. The box in the color scheme is blue, and in Zelda that means wisdom.
You need to say clearly what happened.
So Seed of Courage was going to have the theme of time, where you would need to utilize morning, noon, evening, and night in order to solve various riddles in the game. Okay, so that's not exactly what Oracle of Ages became, but this is very close to the mark. So that means our lost game out of the bunch is this title known as Mystical Seed of Wisdom. Kinda.
And what happened?
So here's what happened. With Seed of Power mostly developed, Flagship continued developing the other games, with Nehru being featured in Seed of Wisdom, and Furore slated to play a major role in Seed of Courage. So it's true that the Mystical Seed of Wisdom game would have had color-based puzzle mechanics, and according to IGN at that time, there would have been various events, areas, and tools built around certain colors, which sounds pretty fitting for the, Game Boy Color. There's further proof for this in 3 different concept sketches for Nehru, with her holding a paintbrush and a palette. Flagship was even looking to connect the trilogy of games through some cell phone adapter technology that would have allowed players to perform a data transfer. This idea would eventually change into the password system we see in the final product used to link the 2 games. And as the project went on, 3 games proved to be too much for the Game Boy Color to handle, and the team struggled to get the password system working across all 3 titles. So Flagship had to drastically scale things back. This resulted in one of the games being scrapped, which I'll say was Mystical Seed of Wisdom, since we lost the color-based system from that title. And based on the themes of being able to change the time of day in Mystical Seed of Courage, it looks like that was the game that became Oracle of Ages. But now that I think about it, if you look at the past setting in Oracle of Ages, there's a slight filter that makes it look like it's later in the day. So my speculation is instead of adding in several different hours of the day, they used the existing filters depicting evening to become Labrina in the past. As for Nehru, she got to stick around instead of Furore, and they ended up giving her the title Oracle of Ages. I'm sorry, Furore. Maybe someday they'll remake this trilogy for a modern console and you'll get your own game this time, fingers crossed. Kirby's Dream Course would be the Super Nintendo debut for the God of Guzzling.
Yeah, boy.
But did you know that Kirby's Dream Course was initially designed as a game titled Special T-Shot? Back in 1992, Special T-Shot was a golf-style game developed by Nintendo, complete with its own original characters. But this game would be put on pause for a bit until Nintendo decided to bring in HAL Laboratory to repurpose the game's framework with their new widely popular character, Kirby! With the working title Kirby's T-Shot, this game would begin Kirby's Super Nintendo era. A significant time for him with 3 new mainline titles, 5 spin-offs, and a cancelled game called Kid Kirby developed by a young dev team in Scotland that would evolve into Rockstar North. Yes, I mean Grand Theft Auto Rockstar. This game also boasts quite an ambitious competitive multiplayer mode, making this the very first game in the series to include multiplayer. Play alongside a friend and they'll get to play as a yellow version of Kirby, who was internally named Kibi by the developers. Kibi combines the word Kiro, meaning yellow in Japanese, and Kirby. And this wasn't supposed to be a separate character. The manual addresses this as Kirby just being yellow for player 2. But as of 2022, within Kirby's Dream Buffet, Kibi makes an official cameo on one of the collectible character treats named Kirby and Kibi, the first time he'd be officially named as such in a game. But you'd think with the release of Kirby's Dream Course, Special T-Shot would never see the light of day. But in fact, Nintendo did end up putting it out to the world in some form, a title for the Satellaview in 1996. The Satellaview is a peripheral exclusively made for the Super Famicom in Japan. And I've talked about it a few times before on this channel, both for Zelda and Mario, but this was a device where players were able to receive data through satellite transmissions directly to their Super Famicom system, which I guess could be looked at as a very, very early version of live service content that we see today. Special T-Shot would be exclusive to the Satellaview, keeping all of the original content but having more or less the same mechanics as Kirby's Dream Course. Samus must go on another journey to recover her power, face off with the Ing and Dark Samus, and uncover the mysteries of Ether. And sure, they could have just gone back and repurposed everything from the first game, but they decided, nah, we're gonna make a fresh one. With Retro wanting to move away from the usual plot of the space pirates and Metroids and use the theme of the conflict between good and evil instead, hence all the parallels found within the game. So to take it a step further, they would consult with the producers of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, known for having 2 versions of Hyrule. Returning to compose the soundtrack was Kenji Yamamoto, who I've failed to mention after all this time, but just know he was the one responsible for the bangers heard throughout Super Metroid and Metroid Prime, and has been the prime supervisor for sound in many of Metroid titles up to this day, except Other M. But Yamamoto would use the light and dark theme to create variations of each track to represent both versions of each realm. Dark Samus would be chosen as the game's main antagonist, a character that was on equal footing as Samus in size compared to all the other massive monsters and space pirates she normally took on. And in a sense, that choice made Dark Samus even more unnerving. They would draw inspiration from the end section of Metroid Zero Mission, the remake to the original Metroid game released on the Game Boy Advance in 2004. In one of the final sections, Samus must travel to a Chozo ruin on Zebes and looks into a mirror before being given a trial that unlocks a brand new power suit. Retro Studios would take this interaction a step further and introduce Dark Samus after thinking fighting herself was cool. This sequel was an ambitious one, with the new Retro president saying that he and the team wanted to expand it as much as they could instead of just slamming out a sequel. But the deadline was tight, set for a 2004 holiday release. As a result, Echoes would only be around 30% complete 3 months before that deadline. Just to put the crunch in perspective here. So many features had to get the cut, including a potentially unlockable extra of a playable Super Metroid. But once again, Retro Studios beat the odds and got out a completed game in November 2004. There was a whole line of Sonic games exclusive for Japan's phones back in the day. Sonic Cafe, a subscription service launched in December 2007 for specific mobile devices. For 315 yen per month, players could access a library of downloadable games from Sonic Team's intellectual properties, many of which were reskinned versions of card and board games. You had classics like Sonic Gammon, an ass-clenching backgammon game between Sonic and Eggman as they trash-talk each other between moves. Well, not really, but we can dream. But there are other titles like Sonic Poker, Reversi, and even Sonic Fishing, which you probably would forget is even related to Sonic after a while. I guess we can pretend this is a day in Big the Cat's life and call it the first game in the series starring our boy. But there are around 35 of these mobile titles, many of which can be dubbed as shovelware and barely related to the Sonic license, but out of all of these games, there are a few highlights worth mentioning. Take Sonic Kart 3DX, a kart racer predating the Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing series. Released for iMode 90X devices, it allowed players to compete over Japan's cellular network in Grand Prix and time attack modes. Having 5 courses and multiple camera options were impressive for the time, though seeing Sonic race alone in this footage today, this makes me sad and I don't know why. Then there is Sonic Golf 3D from 2006, with these interesting models, almost giving it a Sega Saturn aesthetic. This is also compatible for the iMode 90X series, and something about this game is just surprisingly cozy. Nostalgic graphics with these familiar backdrops and a solid soundtrack for an old mobile game. Sonic Hopping was an interesting one to me because it's a jumping puzzle where Sonic has to navigate over holes on a pogo stick to get all the rings on the map. So why not just jump? Was Sonic really this bored that day? But despite this ridiculous concept, this little puzzle game has some depth, getting increasingly more difficult with each passing stage, as the platforms will start to break under Sonic's weight. And what's this? Switches to activate other platforms? I mean, look at this complexity. How come we never got a Sonic Hopping sequel? Oh, we did?
Oh my god!
Sonic Hopping 2, which just seems like Sonic pogo sticked his way into one of Eggman's bases. Okay, that sounded wrong. But you'd think a sequel would give this game a bit more variety, but my gosh, it's literally this the whole time. Talking about these games in detail is a bit challenging because a lot of them are considered lost or partially lost media, and aside from gameplay footage from gaming archaeologists, many of them have just disappeared into the void. Like Nakayoshi Chow. I've heard several people over the years wanting to raise a Chow on their mobile phones, and Sega gave that privilege to Japanese ones only. Nakayoshi Chow, translating to Good Friend Chow, was a 2002 game for iMode 504i devices, and is one of the titles in this lineup that has been completely lost to time. I'm not saying there's no hope, but there's no footage I could find of this game anywhere on the internet. But in this game, you could raise a Chow on your mobile device with similarities to the Chow Garden found in Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2. Though since it's an old mobile device, I'd say it's probably more like the little VMU minigames for the Chow that the Adventure game supported. Since information on this game is scarce, it's hard to know the full depth of the pet system itself, but it seems you'd have been able to pet and talk to your Chow, as well as play games such as Rock, Paper, Scissors. A few screenshots survive, but that's all we have for now until some historian digs this up from the depths of the old cellular graveyard. But finally, here's one I think everyone would appreciate. Shadow Shoot, the second Sonic game to give Shadow a gun. This was a mobile title meant to promote the release of Shadow the Hedgehog, and has Shadow overcoming several stages to get his green Chaos Emerald back from Dr. Eggman. As the screen automatically scrolls, the player will move Shadow to dodge obstacles while shooting enemies. Pretty simple game, but unlike Sonic biding his time on a pogo stick, it actually has a little bit of variety with unique stages throughout. This also included bosses and the ability to upload high scores onto leaderboards. So someone out there was once the ultimate champion of Shadow Shoot, and has no way to prove it. Wait a minute. Samus is a woman? What do you mean your name's not Metroid? Oh my god, she's waving at me. Okay, I know this isn't a surprise to anyone, but this is still discussed as a pretty big twist in gaming, back when there was no internet or social media to spoil it for you. Even in the original manual for the game, they called Samus a he all throughout. So this twist, pretty groundbreaking, right? But who decided on this? How did they make this choice? Let's go back in time to the 80s when Nintendo was flying high after the success of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. This is where unsung Nintendo superstar Gunpei Yokoi comes in to assemble the Metroid squad. I think this guy deserves just as much credit as Shigeru Miyamoto for where Nintendo is today, since he was responsible for producing some of Nintendo's most iconic franchises like Donkey Kong, Wario Land, and Fire Emblem. Unfortunately, he would pass away in a tragic traffic accident in 1997, but his legacy still lives on in a lot of Nintendo products. The game was originally called Space Hunter, the job title of Samus referenced in the game manual. But then they coined Metroid by combining Metro Subway to Android. Popular Japanese studio Intelligent Systems, now known for series like Fire Emblem and Paper Mario, would also jump in to collaborate on this project. Satoru Okada and Masao Yamamoto stepped up to direct, with Okada previously directing titles like Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt. Yamamoto, on the other hand, was a brand new director, his only prior experience at Nintendo being in Game & Watch design. Surprisingly, this was a pretty young and experienced team tasked to make a game this ambitious. A game that focused on non-linear exploration and having the players traverse a map in multiple directions and retrace their steps for upgrades. While The Legend of Zelda accomplished this in its own way, Metroid was a different beast that implemented one singular map with depth. Much like Zelda, Metroid would also lean into the idea of having permanent upgrades, rewarding players who took the time to explore. And the concept of the game itself was heavily inspired by Ridley Scott's Alien, implementing the same desperate, claustrophobic, lonely, and horrific emotion from the film. It was developed for a Japanese exclusive peripheral for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or as it's known in Japan, the Famicom. The peripheral was called the Famicom Disk System, a piece of hardware that allowed the Famicom to use this floppy disk format to run games, giving developers a little boost of disk storage and improved sound. The disk system version of the game also supported save files, but of course, discs come with longer loading times, and every so often the player would have to flip the disc to side B as Samus explores planet Zebes. One thing you may notice from footage of this version though is that it lags a lot less than the NES cartridge version of the game, which is my biggest pet peeve with the original Metroid. And going back to this title can feel very rough at times since it has not aged as well as, say, Super Mario Bros. I'll be honest, this game was a few years before my time, and while I'm sure some of you Metroid veterans have the lag baked into your bones, it's a little too frustrating for me at times. But the most significant addition to this remake is the option to play alongside 4 other players. Shout out to anyone who managed to get a 4-player session going when this game came out, because not only did you need 3 friends, but you needed 3 friends who had Game Boy Advance systems. And those 3 friends also needed to have bought this game. And those same 3 friends also needed to have link cables on hand. So maybe some of you had better luck with this than I did. But technically, you could play Nightmare in Dreamland with 3 other friends using 1 copy of the game, but you couldn't play the main campaign together. You were restricted to the 3 mini-games that were added to this game. So Nightmare in Dreamland would be the first remake for a mainline game in the series. So why did the folks at HAL Laboratory decide on Kirby's Adventure? Why not just make a brand new game? Well, around this time, a Kirby animation was airing in Japan and the US known as Kirby Right Back At Ya. Well, in Japan it was just Kirby of the Stars, which is the name of the Kirby series over there. But while this show was bringing in new fans to the Kirby franchise, HAL Laboratory had no new Kirby game planned to ship alongside the animation, and they agreed this wasn't a good business decision, so their time was limited. And instead of yet another spin-off, they had the idea to port an older game to the Game Boy Advance. Masahiro Sakurai, who at this time was the chief director of the Kirby series, initially suggested a port of one of the Super Nintendo titles, or an entirely new game. They abandoned the idea of a port, worried that audiences would view it as stale, and due to the currently airing animation, there was no time to develop a brand new game. So that left Kirby's Adventure as the game to remake, due to its solid balance for beginner and advanced players. Shinichi Shimomura will return as the director this time, teaming up with Sakurai on this project. There's an old Nintendo Dream interview from 2002 with Sakurai and the other developers, Eitaro Nakamura and Teruhiko Suzuki, who described their biggest challenge with the game was getting 4-player multiplayer to work. It was a brand new feature, and we had to work within the constraints of the original Famicom game, so it was very difficult. It was so hard getting the 4 linked GBAs to stay synced up. Even 1 to 2 months before release, it wasn't working properly. So one day we were having a meeting and Sakurai asks us, "Guys, is this really gonna work?" In addition to this, the team had other ambitious ideas they wanted to include, like a 4th minigame and a unique dance for Kirby for each copy ability. But due to memory limitations and time constraints, these ideas had to be abandoned. Despite the challenges in this crazy link cable orgy situation, Nightmare in Dreamland was a successful GBA title, selling just under 1 million copies. But this title would be the last Kirby game directed by Shinichi Shimomura. In fact, this guy would completely disappear from HAL Laboratory and the gaming industry after 2002. The fate of Shimomura is a topic brought up in quite a few Kirby circles, with speculation on where Shimomura could be now. Some speculate he was unhappy at HAL and left the gaming industry altogether to live a private life. Others believe that Shinichi Shimomura is just an alter ego for another prominent developer at HAL at that time, like Satoru Iwata, Sakurai himself, or Shigesato Itoi, who was responsible for the Mother series. Reading up on this almost sent me down an entirely different rabbit hole, but what's interesting is that there's only a couple of old pictures of this mysterious director from 1994. And this specific picture only made its rounds because somebody dug it up as recently as 2019. And it just surprises me that someone known for being involved in several influential titles for one of the most well-known gaming characters can just successfully spirit away like that. I'm not saying anyone should be hunting this man down, by the way, I just think it's a pretty fascinating mystery. At this stage of the game, Wario had 5 Wario Land titles under his belt. I'm including the Virtual Boy game in this, yes. But all of these were developed by a team at Nintendo called Nintendo R&D 1, the studio that was responsible for both Mario Land titles for the Game Boy and other games dating all the way back to Donkey Kong. Now, while they may have had some help from third parties along the way for the Wario Land series, they would serve as the major development team for those titles. But at E3 2002, the press would see a demo of Wario World for the very first time, which received mixed reception, while IGN would describe the game as another potential hit on Nintendo's hands. I also find it funny that they mention his bodily transformations were noticeably absent. Not to worry though, Nintendo has 6 more months to perfect this promising title, and it wouldn't be a Wario game without them. Spoiler alert, they never added those. With an initial release date of November 2002, Nintendo would continuously push back the game's release date, first to May 2003, and then to June 2003. So now the press was pretty curious about who was responsible for developing this game, and in April 2003, Nintendo of America would spill the beans.
Hookers.
Treasure, the studio responsible for Gunstar Heroes, Sin and Punishment, and Ikaruga were the creators of this game, a Japanese studio with a high reputation from the 90s. But strangely enough, as IGN mentions in their reveal article, nobody from the press could get prominent members of Nintendo of Japan to disclose who was working on Wario World in the first place. But there is some history between these teams though. Treasure previously teamed up with Nintendo R&D 1 to develop Sin and Punishment for the Nintendo 64, an action shooter that never reached the West, but regardless was well received in Japan. Apparently during this collaboration, the two companies wanted to work together again and agreed on Wario World as the next project. I can only speculate here, but perhaps this project went through feature creep after their first E3 showing, pushing Nintendo to reach out to Treasure to hop in and co-develop with them. It would explain all the delays and lack of overall content within the game itself. And I'm thinking there's a ton of cut content out there that we just don't know about. So I mentioned earlier that the game released in the West a whole year before it dropped in Japan, and while I don't know the reason why they would release in the US first, there are some minor differences between the US and Japanese versions of the game. For example, the Black Jewel boss had a whole new phase added to it once Wario does enough damage in the Japanese version, complete with new music and new attack phases from the Black Jewel. Yes, in this phase, Wario can no longer rely on the spritlings to help him. He and the Black Jewel go at it in hand-to-laser combat. So while the Black Jewel has all of these new attack patterns you have to avoid, the objective for Wario is to just keep punching the jewel until it stops moving.
I'm fighting for my life!
But this is like the coolest boss phase in the game, and we never got it. But this is the TheMentok channel. I had to dig deeper, and I had to pay $5 for a retro gaming issue to confirm why this boss phase exists in the first place. Masato Maegawa, the founder of Treasure, wrote several memoirs for the entire Treasure library for Retro Gamer, and had this to say regarding Wario World. We made the Japanese version of Wario World after the overseas edition had been released, so we took the opportunity to make various changes. For example, the main programmer was particularly attached to the last boss, so for the Japanese version, we did a remake. Really, we wanted to make the game a bit bigger and pack in some extra features, but there was only so much that we could do. So yeah, it really makes me feel like a lot more was planned here for both editions of the game. As for the other various changes Maegawa mentions here, it's mainly a few bug fixes from the overseas edition, with the Black Jewel boss being the biggest update that they made.
Be careful, when you pinch Wendy's pennies, they pinch back.
So while they outsourced a lot of this work, one of their animators was named Kathleen Swain, who prior to working on Hotel Mario was part of the animation department at Walt Disney Animation. Oh yeah, and it looks like she worked on films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and The Fox and the Hound. Now, I'm not knocking her talent whatsoever, but I see she's mainly credited as a background artist for those Disney films, so she's most likely responsible for these backgrounds that you see during these cutscenes. But a factor that doesn't get enough credit is the in-game visuals for Hotel Mario. While the animations are a bit janky, and I wouldn't even go as far to say they're the worst I've seen, I'd say the design for the hotels, Mario, Luigi, and many of the enemies aren't that bad. Jeff Zorn was the art director for the title and came up with various themes for the hotel like the treehouse, sky castle, and gothic-inspired buildings throughout the game. He'd lean into elements from Disney and Tolkien as inspiration for the Mario world they created, but this wouldn't be his last dance with Mario overall. He's now part of the Nintendo-owned studio Next Level Games, and would become the lead technical character artist for Luigi's Mansion 3. And the fact that this game also takes place in a hotel almost feels intentional. And then there's this classic voice acting.
We gonna find the princess with the power going out. Maybe there's a switch in one of the rooms. Remind me to check.
This is before the days of Charles Martinet, and every version of Mario had that gruff Brooklyn accent. And I was today 8 years old when I learned that the voices of Mario, Luigi, and Bowser are all the same guy. Meet Mark Grau, who is responsible for every memorable line in this title.
I was actually amazed to find out the amount of content that's on YouTube and across the internet, and quotes, and where they've done cutscenes where they replace their, either use the existing audio and put in all kinds of silly stuff. It was kind of fun to see it come to a whole new light.
And how long did you spend in the booth?
I would think overall for all the characters, maybe 2 hours.
2 hours of work that translated into decades of relevancy. So after doing the research for all of this, I expected a mess of a behind-the-scenes story here after my video on the Zelda titles. But the developers and staff who worked on this title all look back at it positively. Did you know Sonic's very first spin-off game might have been a Japan-exclusive puzzle game? Sonic Eraser, a Sonic-themed puzzle game that released in 1991, potentially making this title Sonic's second official game in the series. Sonic Eraser is playable on the Sega Mega Drive, known as the Sega Genesis in North America. And it was a falling block puzzle game where colorful shapes descended from the top of the screen. Match the pieces to make them disappear and avoid letting that stack pile up too high. If that sounds a lot like Columns or Puyo Puyo, you're not wrong. Though funny enough, Puyo Puyo also debuted in October of that same year. But there's honestly not much else to say about Sonic Eraser. Sure, there's a versus mode, but even for its time, plenty of puzzle games had already done this formula better. The only Sonic thing about it is the title, and Sonic just standing here emoting every once in a while. The game remained pretty obscure, even as Sonic the Hedgehog was flying off the shelves, and that's largely because Sonic Eraser was exclusive to Sega MegaNet, a subscription-based gaming service Sega launched in late 1990. Sega Eraser was included with Sega Game Toshokan, meaning Sega Game Library, a special cartridge that was bundled with a modem peripheral called Mega Modems that allowed players to connect to Sega MegaNet through a dial-up service. And with the subscription, players could download and play games exclusively through that service. Games like Flicky, the Phantasy Star 2 text adventures, and who could forget Megamind? No, not that one. For 4,800 yen, roughly $32 at that time, paid every 6 months, subscribers could download and play games directly through the service, making it one of the earliest forms of subscription-based gaming. Sega MegaNet would shut down in 1992 with reportedly 3,500 subscribers at the time of the end of the service, and Sonic Eraser would become more or less forgotten once the subscription ended. Most of the Western Sonic community never knew this game existed until around 2004. That year, Sega of Japan included Sonic Eraser as part of a new service on their website called B Club, where visitors could download old Mega Drive games. And this gave the fan site Sonic Cult the opportunity to unearth the game, decrypt its files, and release it to the public. So while Sonic Eraser isn't exactly a masterpiece, this has a special place in Sonic history. And it's pretty simple to track down these days, but allow me to stir the pot. The title screen shows that this is clearly taking place within a book called Sonic Eraser, one that Sonic is stuck in until the game is done. That means that this could technically be the very first entry in the Sonic storybook saga, making it a trilogy all along. You heard it here first. So you made it to the new year. Welcome to the next level, my friends. Thank you for watching some of my favorite stories that came out of 2024. If you made it this far, leave a comment below of some of your favorite videos from last year and what series you want me to cover in the future. Until next time, Profit.
Spoken.
Wishing all of you a better year than last year.